Podcast by Friday, episode 27. Fear is a very real thing, but it's a choice. And you can choose not to be afraid, and you can follow our checklist, and you can go forward and get your voice heard. Podcast by Friday with Bill Griggs and Kingsley Grant. We help people to create their minimal viable podcast by taking bold action to defeat procrastination and to get their voices heard.
I'm Kingsley Grant.
And I'm Bill Griggs.
And you're listening to
Podcast by Friday.
Hey, Bill, how's it going, man? It's a brand new day, and it's great to be behind the microphone speaking to you and co-hosting our favorite show, Podcast by Friday. What's going on, man?
I'm doing well, Kingsley. Thank you for asking. This is our 27th episode, and I am enjoying this. We've been giving a lot of knowledge away to our listeners just so that we can make sure that they get their podcast out there by Friday.
You know, I'm really excited about this because even going through this last few episodes since episode 19, it really brought me back to the basics and reminded me of some things I take for granted sometimes. You know, we can get so far ahead and we forget what it's like for the person who is just getting started. So I really thought this series of episodes we've done, our episodes really have kind of put me back in that place. And I think it's reconnecting me. And I think it makes it much more real doing these episodes for the listener who might be in that place where we were a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the whole reason that we started this podcast was to help other people get their podcast started quickly, to get their voices heard, to get out there, to take away all the confusion that's involved in this process, because it is a very complex process to get your podcast out there.
It is, and I think what sometimes I was listening to a podcast show because I do listen to a number of podcasts. And yesterday, the guest that was on this particular show, he basically get guests for podcasts it's a paid service that they offer. And he said about, people who talk about podcasting being easy. He said, number one, either have not done one or have never done one well, because it's a lot of work. And sometimes I think that's what scares people off, because when they think about the monumental aspect of podcasting and how they may hear it and wondering, how do I even get that? It can be kind of scary and nerve-wracking. So I think I can agree with him with that statement, because it's not easy work. I just want to say that straight up front.
No, nothing worth doing well is ever easy. There's always a sequence of events that has to happen in order to make things work right. I mean, you take the space program, for instance. The space shuttle is probably the most complex machine ever built by man, and there are so many things that have to happen in order to make a launch possible.
Yeah, I think I remember, when the space shuttle started, the whole program was put in place, and the curiosity of everyone about how this would work and what's going to happen, and it was really kind of it created a curiosity for me, and because it was something very almost unheard of, a space shuttle. I mean, what is that, but it's a process. The time it took from they began the concept idea to launching that space shuttle was really a few years in the making, because they had to get everything so right to make it happen, which I think is one of those things that I think is, when it comes to comparison here, is the difference. We don't have to get it so perfect a podcast, because this doesn't jeopardize as much life as possible as a space shuttle would. But the sequential process, I think, is something very similar in that it's a time, is a preparation, is how things must go in sequence before that takes place. And I think that's a great example of what we're talking about today, of how launching and publishing your podcast.
Yeah, one of the reasons that the shuttle and all the space programs have been so successful is because they've taken and systematized every step of their process, and they come up with checklists that they use so that they can repeat the sequence every time and make it happen the same way every time. And, that's what you need to do with your podcast so that you don't end up getting all of the prerequisite work done and then not going forward with it. We spent the last few episodes from episode 19 till, episode 26 getting our sequence out there so that you could hear what it was. I mean, we've gone through a lot of, we've given you a lot of the details that you need.
I think, Bill, I like what you just said, because as you said it clicked for me when you said, it's almost like a checklist, because really, even the space shuttle idea, everything had to be checked off. Was this done? Was this done? Was this done? And now you're ready to launch. I think it's the very same thing we're describing here in our podcast. And to launch this podcast by Friday idea is we're going through a sequence of checklists, and we've covered basically the checklist idea in episode 19, for example. We started off by saying, behind the scene, hosting and website tools the person might need. And that's what we thought in our minds, based upon how we've done this, that's the first thing they need to do. And we covered that because that's the first checklist that I believe that they needed to have before they even think about launching.
Yep. And, after that, we told them in episode 20 how to maximize the name of their podcast for success, to think about the keywords and the actual things that people are searching for in order to find your episode. So, the name of your podcast was very important.
And then episode 21 was how to drag and drop website, because we were saying that having a podcast is wonderful and you don't really need a website, but it's important to have a place of your own to host what it is yours. And we talked about in episode 21 about creating a website for your podcast so it can be hosted there. You can do your show notes there. You can send people there. And it becomes the place that they can always go and find out more about you. So we talked about that in episode 21.
Yeah, because we were doing the drag and drop format, it was very easy to maintain instead of, hard and difficult having to go out and hire a programmer to make that happen. You could do it on your own. After that, we talked about the need for podcast cover art. Work. What's your podcast look like when it's sitting there in iTunes or on Spreaker or whatever platform you've got hosting? That was very important. And, we gave you some considerations that you needed to go over to get your artwork together.
Which I think was so key. And we talked about the importance of having the right size, the right color, and why that was so important, because it's going to be shrunk on any of those platforms. And we discussed the need to make sure it's in the right setting. And then episode 23 was the media, what they need. Where are they going to host their podcast? Where are they going to use to keep their files that were created? Because we talked about the idea of not having that on your website because it slows things down, and it's not as easily accessible when things are slowed down, and people don't want to spend so much time having to wait for it to come up. So we talked about that in episode number 23.
Yeah, not only did it have to be fast access to your media, but it also had to be secure so that it didn't get lost. So, that was a very important thing. And in episode 24, we talked about the minimum recording equipment that you needed to get your sound together and into that digital format so that you have podcast media to put up out there. Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that episode for a number of reasons, because I think it brought me back to how, we have our equipment set up right now, and we just take for granted again that, it's just how it's done. But it's really the very the small things, just the right microphone, the filters, and those things were so important. So I really like that episode for that reason, because we kind of go into the nitty-gritty of why you want to have good sound, and why that episode, I believe, was one of our most practical and helpful episodes. They all are, but I think that was the most practical, I think, of the ones we've done.
Yeah, I agree with you on that one, Kingsley, because even in that episode, we gave them a button where they could just click in one button and it would order all that stuff from Amazon, and they wouldn't have to sweat it. It'd be here in a couple of days if you had Prime. Worry none. It's done. Here it comes. So that was really cool.
Yeah, and I think the idea of I like the all in one. You can just go and get that one click, and all that we discussed was right there, and so it saves you as a listener to wonder where can you go to find all this small piece. The foam, the filter, the microphone. We kind of took all that hard work out for you because we believe that we want to make things very minimum, very quickly accessible, and so that can be found at podcastbyfriday.com/what? 24. So again, podcastbyfriday.com/24. You can go there and find this package that Bill was mentioning, and click on that. You can go right to where the recommendations we have for you. And again, it's very, very, I think, cost. It's not where you're going to spend an arm and a leg. We talked about that as well, and why we think this is a good package for you.
Yeah, we kept things at a minimum because that's our whole philosophy, to do the minimum amount that you need to do in order to get it going and functional, and then upgrade as you gain more experience. Now, we also talked about in episode 25 the recording and video software that we use to create each episode. It's very important that you have good, reliable software that gives you good sound and doesn't do funky things to your recordings as you're doing. And so if you're interested in that stuff, that's in episode 25, and you can check out that.
As a matter of fact, where you mentioned about the funky stuff, we had something very interesting that happened to us that you wanted to listen to, because in that episode you'll hear how things can go a certain way when the actual recording may not necessarily happen the way you plan for it to happen. But I won't tell you what it is. Go back and listen to the episode and see if you can identify when something went right or wrong. I'll let you decide what that was. Mm-hmm. And in episode 26 is the 5 most popular podcast formats we believe that will help to grow your audience. And I really like the fact that this was done, because I think what we discussed was, what kind of format that really makes the show more popular, easier. People are more in tune to listen because it creates for that audience, the person who's listening, a sense of the dynamic is fluid, it's so unpredictable. And we discussed that in episode number 26.
Yeah, just briefly, when we mention formats, we mean what's the style of the show? Is it question and answer? Is it going to be a narrative? How is the episode going to sound to the listener every weekend? If you want a deep dive into that, then you could go in episode 26 and listen to that. And in fact, each one of the episodes that we've talked about, episode 19 through 26, you can get to them quickly by going to podcastbyfriday.com, putting a slash, and then the number of the episode that we've discussed. So if you want to see episode 19, it's podcastbyfriday.com/1919. Or you can do the same thing on episode 26 and find out about the different formats by going podcastbyfriday.com/26. It'll get you there, and you'll have some really great information concisely expressed in those episodes, and you'll be able to follow these sequences.
And that's so important because it leads us to where we are today, basically the launching stage of the Shuttle, but it's our podcast idea, your podcast you've been working on. And we're really excited about this episode because I think really it's one thing to get all the preparation done, all the work in, and then you freeze, then you procrastinate, and you sit there. And I think that's one of the most terrible things that happen. How many people have worked up and started and stopped and never actually launched because of fear or not knowing the next step or what to do? And I think today's episode is going to help that person now pull the trigger and get their podcast up. And we discussed that in this episode today.
I remember when I was getting started, that is exactly what happened to me. I recorded an episode of the podcast, and then for whatever reason was afraid to publish it, or didn't. I also didn't know some of the basic skills that we've taught in these past episodes that I needed, and the steps that I needed to take to get that from my digital recorder into iTunes, into Spreaker, into the internet, so people could find it. And fear is a very real thing, okay, but it's a choice, okay, and you can choose not to be afraid, and you can follow our checklist, and you can go forward and get your voice heard.
And which leads us then into one of the most popular places that most podcasters publish on, and for a big reason, because it's one of the bigger platforms, is iTunes. And we want to start with that today, where how do you launch your podcast and publish that on iTunes? And I wanted to mention up front that if you go to podcastbyfriday.com/10, the number 10, you'll be able to hear more of what we discussed about this idea. But today we're going to go through and give you like a checklist of what we believe will get you on iTunes, or two of the platforms we use very often, iTunes and Spreaker, and what you'll need to get there. So Bill, let's start off with the iTunes platform of the launch process.
Yeah, there's a reason that most podcasts are listed in iTunes, and that's because iTunes is the 5,000-pound gorilla in the room. iTunes has the majority of podcast episodes because iTunes was really the first one to popularize it and to make it easy, to be relatively easy anyway, to be done. And your episode needs to be on iTunes. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. If you are putting out a podcast, it needs to be on iTunes, among other places. So like Kingsley said, we discussed this in episode 10, and we talked about the importance of getting your episode on iTunes and some of the advantages, like the new and noteworthy categories, and getting your podcast listed and maybe discovered during the first couple of months of its existence. So it is very important to go and follow through and get on iTunes. So we'll talk about some of the steps that are needed to do this. One of the first things you need to get your podcast on iTunes is the iTunes app installed on your computer. And the iTunes app can be gotten through Apple Store. You just go down and download it. It's a free app, and you load it on your computer. It is necessary and essential to have that. So, and the thing, you might be saying, I don't have an iPhone or app, and you say, well, okay, I don't, that may not be for me. Before you even shut us down, this process we're going to discuss, or these steps, are also something very similar you could do to Google Play and Android, but we're going to specifically speak about the iTunes here, because that's another place you can host your and even though then we also want to recommend you still do iTunes. Yeah. Well,
iTunes
is not platform specific. You can have iTunes on a Mac. You can have iTunes on a PC. It'll even go on I'm not 100% positive on this statement, on a Chromebook. I'm not sure, but you can figure it. Yeah. You can find it and let us know if we are right or wrong on that one. So that's your homework assignment. Yeah. Somebody let us know. Can you do iTunes on a Google Chromebook?
We're not going to search for it. That's you can do. Let us know. That's how we can engage. And we said, hey, is audience participation here? So that's a great. I'm glad you mentioned that, Bill. But I think once you go to get the app and you download the app and you go into the app, the next thing you want to do is on the right-hand side, you see where it says how to click on submit a podcast. So you will see, if you just right there, scroll down somewhat, you see it says submit a podcast. Click on that, and it's going to take you to the next tab where it's going to ask you to insert your Apple ID and password. That means you have to have an Apple ID, which can be created very easily. You can go through and get that done, and you're going to submit your Apple ID and password on that screen, and then follow the prompts from that point on. and then you enter your information for your podcast.
And that's basically it. That gets your episode into iTunes. Now, we're assuming that you've already recorded your episode because you need an audio file to do this with. Okay.
Yes.
So that's the assumption we're making in this description at this point. But, if you follow the steps that Kingsley just mentioned, it will get your file from your computer up onto Apple's servers and listed in their podcast listings for iTunes.
And we recommended in the past episodes that you submit at least 3 episodes recorded, because if someone goes there and finds your podcast and really dig it and say, man, this is so great, but only have 1, it's like, they may not come back. But if they have 2 or 3, then they're like, oh, man, I can't wait for more. So you're whetting their appetite real good. And that's why we suggested you to have at least 3 podcast episodes recorded and submitted to iTunes. And you wait for an email, because it may take up to sometimes 72 hours for iTunes, to Apple to respond to you and say, hey, your podcast has been accepted, and here's the link, and you're up and go, and you're ready to go. So that's the iTunes platform.
Yep. Now, we're all about progress, and we realize that you may not have 3 episodes recorded yet. Don't let that stop you from putting your episodes up on iTunes. Just get your podcast out there. Don't let procrastination stop you. Get it out there, and then immediately start recording your other episodes and get those out there in quick fashion, because it's going to be 72 hours before your podcast goes live anyway. Why not use the time to put out a couple of extra episodes?
I agree. That's a good point you're making. And so we don't want nothing to get in the way. And that's why we're saying, hey, it's overcome procrastination. And if this is going to keep you from publishing or launching, then don't let it get in the way. Just get 1 episode up and get started.
Yeah, just to amplify what you said, Kingsley, at this point, it should be like a snowball rolling down a snowy hill, gaining momentum, getting bigger and bigger as it moves. Nothing's going to stop it until it hits the bottom. So, just keep going.
I'm glad you used that illustration, because you live in a place where you have a lot of snow. I don't have here any in South Florida. We just get on the hill. And actually, we don't even have a hill. It's so flat down here. We don't even. We can't create unless we go to a falls place and create, fall snow. It's not the same thing. So,
well, don't let that stop you, Kingsley. Just come up north. We got all the snow and the hills you need, and we'll still get it done.
See, nothing will stop us. If it means going up there and when it's snowing and doing it, we'll make it happen. And that's the attitude we want you to have about your podcast.
All right.
So Spreaker is another one, Bill, and you're more, I think, because you do. I think you're more versed on this than I am. Why don't you go ahead and walk us through this Spreaker process? Yeah,
Spreaker was really the aha moment I had when I went to my first podcast movement conference, and I was in a class that Joel Bogus and Russ Johns were teaching on how to launch a podcast. We had gone through all the steps in that class on how to get your podcast started and how to try and rate it and new and noteworthy. That was the whole point. And there was a very long process that we've just described here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 steps to get your podcast out there. Well, it's actually more like 14, but there's 7 steps. Let's just go with it to do it. And at the end of this workshop, Russ said, now we've shown you the hard way. Now let's show you an easier way. And to me, this is easy. So that's why I do it.
Okay.
And he showed us Spreaker, and what he did. Spreaker is a web hosting, not a web hosting, but a media hosting platform. Okay, it's where you can store your podcast episodes, just like iTunes. It's also a directory, just like iTunes. Okay. What Spreaker does that iTunes doesn't is it also provides you apps either online or that you can download onto your smartphone, onto your computer or whatever, that are full recording studio apps. And so you could record a live podcast episode while while we're talking, while right now, push a button and it pushes it out into the internet and you're done. You have a podcast episode. Or you could upload a podcast episode, which is the method I do because I'm not capable
and you recommend this uploading idea more so than the app, right?
Yeah, it gives you more control over the sound quality of your episode. And I think it actually gives you better sound quality to upload your file than to have it create and do the compression online. But again, it's about lowering the barriers to getting your episode out there, and Spreaker does that very well. In order to create a podcast, you'd have to go to Spreaker, and that's spelled SPREAKER.com. It's like speaker, only with an R in it. So you go to Spreaker.com and sign up for one of their free platforms. Okay. Now, if you decide at some point...
Free account, you mean?
Yeah, for one of their free accounts. If you decide at some point later that you'd like to go with one of their more professional services, which offer more features and et cetera, then you can do that. There's no reason to come out of pocket with money to get started. Spreaker, you can do it for free. So you'd go in to Spreaker.com and you'd create an account and, enter all your information. And that from that point on, you can either choose to download their software, or you can upload your file. And in the case of uploading the file, you just click on the upload button that's, in your browser and select your file that you've already stored on your computer to send up there. Now, there is a caveat. It should be an MP3 format for the best sound quality. So, hopefully you record it in that format, or you can convert it inside of your, Audacity or, Audition or whatever software GarageBand that you're using for your episode. But you upload that file, you click OK, and, there it goes. Type in the information about your episode, the name of the episode, etc., and hit publish, and off it goes. It creates the RSS feed for the episode. It sends out all the information that's needed and everything, and it will automatically share your episode to iTunes. You can also set it up for YouTube, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, some of the social media chapters, etc. And it does that all automatically, including Google Play and Stitcher. So that's why I use Spreaker, because it just works.
And in episode 19, that podcast by Friday.com/19, you'll hear we talk about a number of these things behind the scene, hosting and website tools. You'll find some of that information located there. So we want to recommend you do that by listening to episode 19, as Bill described so well, how to get your show up on Spreaker. And one of those things that Bill mentioned, because Bill, you mentioned a couple of times, and I think I don't know if you use the idea of new and noteworthy. I know we've covered this before, but I'm not sure the person who has not listened to that. Why do you mention new and noteworthy? Because I know iTunes have that special thing where they try to get your show. Why did you mention that?
Well, new and noteworthy is probably the only time everyone is guaranteed to have their podcast promoted in iTunes and, to be given the spotlight for a few minutes. So when a new podcast comes out, iTunes very smartly features those podcasts in a section of the iTunes app so that people can see and discover them. And depending on how many people download your episode and listen to it, you move up the charts, and you move up the charts very quickly inside of your category, and it can help you build momentum and get your maybe a sponsor at some point or whatever. But there are people like Joel Bogus who specialize in making sure that your podcast has every chance for success during the new and noteworthy phase, because that lasts for 8 weeks that you can be inside of that, and you can move up the chart. I know I got my my podcast, which was CNC Router Tips. If you want to hear an episode, go to cncroutertips.com. All the way up to number 2 in the software and how-to category in iTunes New and Noteworthy, and that was quite a feat, and it was a systematic approach that we used to do it. One that I suggest you look into. So, I mean, you just launched your podcast. You might as well keep doing the work you need to do to promote it and get it as high as you can in New and Noteworthy.
And I guess again, as Bill's describing all of that, and I think it's so important for him to mention that, because you might be questioning and wondering what's new and noteworthy, so you have a good explanation of what that is, and what you can try to get your podcast in that category, and we're going to mention a few things that you could do that would also help you. But before we get there, we discussed also, Bill, that they can get their show, because you mentioned about Spreaker will share your show for you on Google Play and also Stitcher. But I know that you can also submit your show to those platforms as well, because I've done that myself too with my podcast, and so that gives you a chance to have another way for people to access your show who might be like, for example, Stitcher. That's where I listen to most of my podcast episodes of other people's show, is on Stitcher. And as a matter of fact, in 2018, or I think it's end of 17, some of the auto dealers are installing Stitcher in their cars, so that it comes automatically, so you can find even podcasts there. So I want to recommend you jump on the bandwagon very soon, so at least that will be available for the newer cars that are having that. So, but anyway, Google Play is also where you can get your show uploaded for people who are on Android users, can have access to all your shows as quickly as possible.
It's funny you mentioned the Stitcher thing, Kingsley, because I have never listened to an episode of any podcast on Stitcher. And
really?
It's just, what you got comfortable with when you first started. It never really occurs to me. Although our episodes are shared out and syndicated on Stitcher as well, it's just not one of the platforms that I've gone to. So it's nice to hear that you do like it, and maybe I'll check it out sometime in the future. The switching topics to Google Play, for years, Android users could not listen to podcasts.
Yeah.
Period. There was no way, there was no platform they could do it. They had to load it into some other app, maybe like Stitcher, in order to listen to a podcast. Well, Google got into the mix, and they created Google Play, which is another platform similar to iTunes that has content available. You would be foolish if you just kept your episode on one platform, iTunes or Stitcher or Spreaker or Google Play, when they're all available, and for very little work, you can put your content everywhere. You can put it on YouTube, put it on SoundCloud, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, social media. You can put it everywhere, and you should.
But as a matter of fact, here's, as I hear talking, what if we I have a sheet that has the places that you can submit all of your podcast to at least get as much exposure as possible. What if we make it available, and if they request that, we'll have a where they can sign up for it, just their email information, and we just send a download to them right away if they need that one page of all the places to put their podcasts on, and to get as much exposure as possible. That would be, I think, a way to.
I think that would be very useful. Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very useful. We should definitely do that.
Okay.
So if you would like a copy of that sheet, where should they go, Kingsley?
If they go to the podcastbyfriday.com/19, we'll have a link right there that they can have access. So it makes it easier for them to have to go on another place. What do you think?
Okay. Beautiful.
Yeah, so at least that way they don't have to go to, we're already sending them there for the show notes as it is. We can have it right there to make it available for a download.
All right, fantastic. Kingsley, one of the things that I mentioned, this is kind of a side topic for our listeners, but, we just talked about getting your episode some attention through New and Noteworthy and being found in all these various places, Google Play and SoundCloud and iHeartRadio and all those places. One of the things you got to remember about all of those media hosting platforms and everything is that they're giant search engines. And you get found based on tags that you have in your episode. And a lot of people will ignore this when they're setting up their podcast episode, but there's a place where you can enter tags. And, a tag, for those who aren't familiar, is just another word for a keyword. Some bit of information that is included in that episode, and you're trying to, tell people about it.
Like, for example, this episode we are doing today, we'll have tags of launch a podcast or publish your podcast. That could be one tag. So it could be a one word. It could be a combination. Some places don't allow you to have any space in your tag. It has to be all together because it treats, if you put a space in there, it tells them that you have finished that with one tag. So I guess it varies from platform to platform, but the important thing is that these are the keywords that you want people to find when they type into Google search or wherever that would bring them to find where you are. So you have to be very intentional, very strategic about the words you choose in creating a tag so that people can find whatever content you are now putting out there, in this case, a podcast.
Yeah, and with the tags, you have to be a little methodical about it and think about it ahead of time. What it is that is the core of your episode that you want to think about. And I know that we've discussed this topic before, and if not, we need to go into a little more detail. We can maybe do it in a future episode. But it is a very important part of the secret sauce.
Why don't we, the next episode 28, talk about optimization? Because what we're talking about is how to optimize, how to get your show seen much more than just, you have done all the hard work and putting the show together, all the sequence we've gone through. You just don't want to have to work out there and just, fall flat and then go to the next one. And I think I've been guilty of that, Bill, where I have put in a hard work on putting my podcast together, done all the show notes and all of that. And then I move on and not spend enough time to really make sure that I've maxed out the possibility for the show to be found, as often as possible and as many places as possible. And I've failed in that myself in many, in my own show at, Smooth Career Change, but also in our podcast by Friday, we've also failed in that regard. So we're also going to do that for ourselves as well. So it may be selfish, but you can listen in on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to get into a habit and create a system of promoting your podcasts and having them re-promoted later on, if there is such a word. But it's not just set and forget. An episode can bring you listeners for years and across thousands of different people, but they have to be able to find it. And that's part of what the optimization, with the tags and everything will be. And, Kingsley, that kind of brings us to this next topic, which kind of falls in line with it, about having the one page.
Yeah. And I think that's where it's really, we want to make certain that what we've discussed in this show and this podcast, I think is so important because it's a launch stage, as we mentioned earlier, that we don't want you to have a way to have one more excuse and not get the show out. And so we created for you a one page, like I mentioned before, a checklist basically that you can have to get all we've discussed here in one place. And you can have that, again, by going to podcastbyfriday.com/launch checklist.
Fantastic. And just like the space shuttle would not be successful without its checklist, your podcast probably won't be successful without a checklist and a system. And this is a great way for us to help you, to help yourself.
So as we can revise here, summarize this show, I think we talked about how the idea of putting all the hard work in and a sequential, we want to remind you that episodes 19 to 26 are key to this launch, because we went through all that you need, and we discussed that earlier, episode 19, 20, 21, and all the way to 26. And now you're launching your show. But I believe that this part is so key to the final stage, and that's why I think it's so important to get that one-page checklist to have beside you as you go through the process, and you can get your show up. And what word you would say? Blast off, yeah, and blast off. And we want to hear about your blast off. So make sure that when you've done that, you let us know. Send us a link. Let us know you've done it, and we want to check it out for you, and at least give you some shout outs about what it is you've done, because that would mean a lot to us.
Hashtag blast off. You know, we would we would love to hear about your success with this process, and we would love to hear from you and answer any questions you have, or just share in the joy that you got your episode out there, you got your podcast started, and you got your voice heard. We would love to feature some of you in your best work in an episode. So contact us. You know, you can reach us at podcast by Friday. You can reach us at podcast@podcastbyfriday.com. For email. Or, you can come on our private Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/podcastbyfriday. I mean, there's a million ways to get a hold of us, and we encourage you to do that.
We want to hear from you. And so with that said, Bill, I think it's really, they've blasted off, and we just wanted to make sure we see them do that great, what you call that, when the shuttle has taken off and it's just got into that place where it's now in that zone where it fires off and just start doing the, I guess I'm not really familiar with all that goes into that, but I love to hear them when they've really made it and they're like settled in, so to speak, and they're kind of circling the the universe.
I think you mean orbit, Kingsley.
That's the word. Thank you so very much.
Yes.
When they're in orbit. So we want to hear about you being in orbit with your podcast.
Well,
it's one of the beauty about doing a co-hosting show, because it gives us a chance to feed off and learning, which we talk about in episode 26 about the format. This format here of the co-host, I love it because these are the things that happen and you hear it raw and unfiltered.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, man. I love the fact that we can laugh about these things, because I know how many times I get tongue-tied in an episode. It's just it's refreshing when it's you.
It is refreshing. And so don't forget then to send us an email at podcastbyfriday.com and join us in our Facebook groups. But let us hear from you very, very soon.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into another episode of Podcast by Friday. We really look forward to hearing from you, and go ahead, take bold action. Get your voice out there. Be heard. This is the section of our show where we would normally pause for a word from our sponsor. Now, if you would like to be that sponsor of the Podcast by Friday show, and you have a product or service that you feel would be of benefit to new entrepreneurs starting their new podcast, then contact us at podcast@podcastbyfriday.com, and we'll see if you'd be a good fit. Podcast by Friday. Take bold action to create your minimal viable podcast today. Check out new episodes at podcastbyfriday.com or on iTunes or Spreaker.